Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking and going into a little bit deeper about sort of the sentiments behind the sort of preservation of public health in general, right? And so I guess kind of thinking about this in the beginning, we kind of want to think about some of the, technologies that, public health sort of uses in order to routinely, regulate certain bodies. And obviously, we can think about sort of, people like obviously claim to, say that there are objective forms of technology that exist, in order to preserve the health and safety of certain bodies. But obviously, when thinking about biopolitics, we obviously have already gone into deep discussion about why that would not be true, right? And so if we're thinking about sort of things like, medical hotspotting, right? That's definitely one of those practices that, uses things like, what are those things called? Geographic information systems. It uses those things in order to profile certain bodies and certain populations that are vulnerable or who need medicine, right? And they use that in order to attempt to, give certain people care, whether that's at home or sort of different types of, infrastructures that, are deemed hospitals, at certain particular costs. And so these things are targeted, obviously, as, against those populations, based upon the idea of the preservation of those bodies, right? But what's actually happening is that the aim of those things that helps to help those people who don't have access to those things, it reproduces the stigma that sort of that those people are undeserving of that care in the first place, because those people are dependent and unable to provide care for themselves. And so basically what it's trying to get at is that the way that the law, the way that the nation state works, the way that the WTO works, is it racializes populations, right? It fixes those technologies. It uses technoscience, it uses engineering, it uses all of these things in order to produce ableist understandings of how certain bodies should be living, right? And so thinking about how all of these technologies exist in order to sort of limit the freedom of certain dispossessed groups who exist in certain populations that are deemed unlivable, right? Then we can kind of like ring back to Foucault, right? Who's literally kind of questioning like all of the institutions such as schools, banks, hospitals, employments, like all of those places exist and represent the prison, right? And they're byproducts of the prison. And so that's kind of where I was kind of getting at before, is like trying to understand how, understand, think about Simone Brown, right? Simone Brown is a great author who's literally talking about biometrics, right? Talking about biometrics as a technology, right? And thinking about how, the ownership, of and access to certain property is a right, or and so that would be a place I would explore, because I'm pretty sure she's talking about intellectual property, right? And so thinking about that in the context of providing abolitionist consciousness, right? That's a really important thing to understand in the context of wanting to resist the sort of way that technologies operate and maintain violence. And so even if the resolution is attempting to provisions on intellectual or property rights, what you're trying to say is that all of these things are part of slavery, right? Are part of slavery. It's afterlife, is part of surveillance, right? It's part of the prison, right? It's like none of these things are new, right? Slavery, slave patrols, all of these things are about the surveillance of Black life, right? It's about the categorization of Black life. It's about the designation of certain bodies, right? It's about the regulation of those bodies. It's about violent technologies such as, things like facial recognitions, retina scans, all of the type of, facial recognitions that exist in order to, designate certain bodies, also work in order to, regulate certain bodies and also deem them, capable and worthy of certain technologies. And so, yes, the resolution in of itself is attempting to say and take an objective stance stance on the type of things that certain bodies need. But what it's not understanding is that those things are caught up, right, in a sort of biopolitical process that legitimizes certain forms of difference, and it sort of locates that, based upon race, right, based upon gender, right, based upon who has the access, right. And so thinking about that, and yes, most AF teams and most teams who are reading, policy apps will say that, you're talking about the status quo, that there's a chance that, you can reproduce and produce new technologies that give people access to something they didn't have before. But ultimately, that is the logic of the nation state, is that it strips, bodies of certain things so that it can give it back to them, in little by little, while still saying that, while still claiming that it's radical, right? And that is the logic of domination, of colonialism. And that's how technologies continue to foster racializing processes. And that's kind of where you want to go when discussing, technology, when discussing innovation, when discussing, when discussing sovereign power, right? Those are the types of things you want to be talking about when trying to make your app. Thank you.